In Season 1, Red Bull were on top, but it was Perez who won the title ahead of Max. What a start to the save, and what a start for Audi, who got 0 points and finished dead last. Well, onto the driver moves, and at mid-season, Russell was dropped and replaced by Nick de Vries. This meant Sargent went to AlphaTauri and Lawson went to Williams. But at post-season, Alonso retired and Piastri replaced him at Aston Martin, Zhou went to McLaren, Magnussen then went to Alfa Romeo, Albon went to Haas, Sato replaced him at Williams, and finally Hamilton was dropped by Mercedes as they let Russell back in. There were also aero and chassis regulation changes for Season 2, and the performance graph isn't looking good for Audi as the rest of the grid looks pretty normal. In Season 2, Red Bull was still on top as Max got his first title of the save in dominant fashion, getting 10 wins and 12 podiums. The Audi drivers once again finished pretty much dead last as they were one of the 3 teams to not score a point. Alpine have jumped Aston Martin in the standings into 4th, so maybe that is a team to watch out for. Onto the transfers, and at mid-season there was one change as Sato was dropped and replaced by Hauger. But at post-season there was a lot. Hamilton gave up on the sport first, and then Hülkenberg went to AlphaTauri. Sargent replaced him at Haas, Hauger and Lawson were dropped and Deruvala and Stroll replaced them at Williams. Perez went to Aston Martin to replace Stroll. Sainz went to Red Bull and Russell replaced him at Ferrari. Gasly went to Mercedes and Zhou replaced him at Alpine. Albon went to McLaren, De Vries went to Haas and Sato replaced Nick at Mercedes. There were no reg changes for Season 3 and the graph still says Audi are very far off, but also that Aston Martin are level with Red Bull despite finishing behind Alpine. Season 3 now and Max is once again champion as he finished 51 points ahead of Sainz. Red Bull stayed on top again as they were first and second in the drivers and claimed 11 out of the 16 available wins. Gasly got 1 win though in his Mercedes and Perez also got 1 in his Aston Martin. And the Audis are still very last. At mid-season, Deruvala was dropped and Sargent went back to Williams, Lawson went to Haas and Sato went to Aston Martin, which let Piastri go to Mercedes. At post-season, Hülkenberg retired and Stroll went to AlphaTauri. Tsunoda went to Williams and De Vries went back to AlphaTauri. Sato went to Haas, Pourchaire went to Aston Martin and Drugovich joined Audi to replace Theo. For next season there's powertrain and durability regulation changes and the graph shows us that Mercedes have fallen off. Alpine and McLaren look good and Aston Martin are the best team. Oh, and Audi are awful. It's Season 4 and we have change. Leclerc won the title and he won it in a Ferrari. Ferrari also got their first Constructors title since 2008 and what a season it was for them. Russell and Leclerc got 12 out of the 16 race wins and they completely dominated. Max also didn't even get a win as Sainz was the better Red Bull driver and the Audis were still down the order. At mid-season, Drugovich was dropped by Audi and Hauger moved there. But at post-season, there wasn't much change as Sainz was punished by Red Bull for beating Max as they replaced him with Pourchaire. Magnussen went to Aston Martin to replace Pourchaire and Drugovich went to Alfa Romeo. No reg changes for Season 5 and the performance graph shows a very close grid. We could be about to witness something different happening in the standings. Well, Gasly won in Season 5 from Piastri. Yes, it's Mercedes winning a Constructors, big shock. Pourchaire was also a good match for Max as he was only 24 points behind. Apart from all of this though, there isn't much else to say, but Audi did finish ahead of AlphaTauri. In the driver market, Bottas retired and Zhou went back to Alfa Romeo. Norris went to Alpine to replace him, Stroll replaced the outgoing Norris and Ocon went to AlphaTauri. Sargent went to Alpine, Deruvala went back to Williams, Perez retired, Sato went to Aston Martin and Tsunoda went to Haas. And finally, Sainz went to Williams, De Vries was dropped and Doohan went to AlphaTauri. For Season 6, there's massive reg changes as aero, chassis and durability are affected. The performance graph shows some massive gaps as Aston Martin are all alone, the top 3 are not separated by much and Audi have closed the gap. For Season 6, it was crazy. Norris won the championship in his Alpine with 6 wins and 9 podiums ahead of Magnussen in his Aston Martin. Aston won the Constructors as well and Albon in his McLaren carried as he got 4 wins. Sato also managed a win to make it 4 different new race winners in one season. Haas and Alfa Romeo were also 6th and 5th, but I've ignored the obvious. What the hell has happened to Ferrari and Mercedes? Audi can capitalise on this though as they were the only team not to score. On to driver moves and these weren't as crazy. At mid-season Deruvala was dropped and Iwasa replaced him, but at post-season Russell was dropped by Ferrari and replaced by Nick de Vries. Gasly was dropped by Mercedes being replaced by Lawson and finally Vips went to Haas. There were powertrain regulation changes and the performance graph is very different. Well, first of all Audi fell off big time but Aston Martin are now top ahead of Red Bull and McLaren. Ferrari and Mercedes are now midfield teams and it's only really AlphaTauri and Audi at the back as Haas, Williams and Alfa Romeo have joined the midfield. Season 7 now and the madness continues. Well, Magnussen was champion as Aston Martin won another Constructors title. K-Mag beat Albon by 9 points as McLaren finished second in the standings. Alpine were third as Mercedes kind of recovered to fifth and Ferrari could only finish 8th. Haas also fell off big time after their 6th place, and Alfa remained in the upper midfield as they were 6th. The Audis were still far off getting involved in this weird period of F1, which was very annoying. But onto the driver moves, and a mid-season, Doohan went to Mercedes and Lawson went to AlphaTauri. But at post-season, after winning the title, Magnussen retired and Sainz went to Aston Martin. Russell went back to Williams, Vips was dropped and Fittipaldi went to Haas. Ocon was also dropped and De Vries went back to AlphaTauri. Again. Vesti went to Ferrari, and finally Sargent was dropped and Verschoor went to Alpine. There were no reg changes, and McLaren and Aston Martin are now very far ahead of any other team. In Season 8 it was back to reality as Red Bull won the Constructors and Verstappen won the Drivers. He went toe to toe with Pourchaire throughout the season and was only separated by 6 points. Sainz also got 5 wins in his Aston as they finished second, but considering they were the second fastest car, McLaren underperformed. Audi also finished above AlphaTauri with 0 points as once again they were nowhere. Onto the drivers, and at mid-season Vesti was dropped and replaced by Hauger. Sargent went to Audi as Doohan was dropped and replaced by Ocon at Mercedes. And finally Verschoor was dropped and Vips went to Alpine. At post-season De Vries was dropped, Novalak went to AlphaTauri, Stroll was dropped and replaced by Iwasa. Hauger went to Williams, Vips went to Ferrari, Vesti went to Alpine, Drogovic was dropped and Fittipaldi went to Alfa Romeo. Kalen Williams went to Haas and Piastri was dropped as Doohan returned to Mercedes. For next season there are big reg changes as aero, chassis and durability are once again affected, and the performance graph shows Aston Martin, Alpine, Red Bull and McLaren are all at the top and Audi climbed to only the 4th worst car. Season 9 and we finally have an F2 champion. Iwasa claimed the title convincingly as Alpine won the Constructors. As the performance graph said, Alpine and McLaren were good, and the Williams of George Russell claimed more points than all of Mercedes and Ferrari combined. Audi was still far off it, and even with the big teams out of the equation, they just could not catch up. Transfers for Season 10 now, and at post-season Sainz retired and Lawson went to Aston Martin. Gasly went back to AlphaTauri, Armstrong went to Mercedes, Pourchaire was dropped by Red Bull and replaced by Vips, Doohan was dropped and Boschon went to Ferrari, Novalak was dropped and Caldwell went to AlphaTauri, and finally Vesti was dropped and replaced by Verschoor at Alpine. For the final season, there were no reg changes, and once again the teams have just given up development or something. Some of them have flatlined again. So Season 10 and Norris gets his 2nd title. He was only 10 points ahead of Lawson, who got more wins but less points. But the best news of all, Audi got their first and only point in the save thanks to Vettel in the final season, which clinched 8th in the Constructors. But if you did enjoy it nonetheless, subscribe to the channel, like the video, and I'll see you again in the next one. Thanks for watching and goodbye.